Welkom in Amsterdam. Hello there and welcome to Amsterdam. This is City Breaks Amsterdam, episode 11, the prosaically titled Food and Shopping episode. I'm Marion Jones, and the plan for today is a tour through some of the things you may wish to eat and drink in Amsterdam, and some of the places where you could best go if you fancy doing a little bit of shopping. Not ordinary shopping, more sort of souvenirs and bits and pieces to take home. So, as I believe they say in Dutch, laten we gaan, which I think means let's go. Starting with a section on all things food and drink. And first of all, what else? Cheese. If you try either Edam or Gouda, which I think the Dutch call much more throatily something like Gouda, that might be wrong. If you try either of those, you'll be immediately struck by the idea that they are much more flavoursome than anything you've eaten outside Holland. So I'd recommend looking for either of those, or a third alternative, Maasdammer, another classic, although much less well known outside the Netherlands. One of those cheeses which is full of large holes and has a very nutty taste. So, the place I would suggest to experiment with all of these things is the Kaaskamer, which I think actually means cheese shop, and is in the middle of the 9 Streets area. I'll put the links, by the way, to all the shops I mention and restaurants at the end in the show notes. So in the Kaaskamer you have the choice of over 400 different types of cheese and a whole host of passionate and trained cheese specialists on hand to help you do some tasting, cheese itself, or perhaps their homemade cheese fondue, or maybe you'd just like some advice on what to buy and take home, or perhaps on putting a cheese platter together, something to take back to your apartment, if you're self-catering that is, and savour there. Alternatives are available. I might mention one called Vegevies, if that's how you say it, more than 100 years old, in the middle of the Jordaan area, which you're likely to be visiting anyway, and another one just opposite the flower market, which again, surely you will be passing through. Once you've tried the cheese, you must move on to herring, a very traditional Amsterdam product. Herring has been coming in and out of Amsterdam for centuries, and the key fact is the idea that it was here, so they say, where fishermen first worked out how to cure fish and keep them for much longer. If you're interested in how, it's basically gut them and then treat them with salt. Anyway, this allowed them to keep them for much longer and to make them the basis of a trade, catching them, curing them, exporting them. And it became really a huge contributor to the Amsterdam economy. Such, in fact, that the Dutch food writer Johannes van Dam wrote this sentence: "The silver from the sea gave the Dutch the golden age." And if you want to join in today, look out for a haring handle, which is one of those movable herring carts that you find all over the city, particularly in the street markets, and you can pick some up. You might get, for example, something called a broodjeharing, which I think is the Dutch for bread and herring, sandwiched together, to make, yes, a sandwich, and served with pickles and onions. It is eaten raw, and said to be sweetest in the summer between May and July, but you will certainly find it for sale all year round. Other snack foods: bitterballen, crispy deep-fried little balls with a savoury filling, usually meat-based, served with mustard generally, often in pubs and brown cafes and whatnot. A sort of snacky food, something to have along with your drink. As is the other battered deep-fried morsel, the kibbeling, which has got fish inside it, usually cod, and is served with a mayonnaise herb sauce and perhaps some lemon, and perhaps some frietjes, chips. Although frietjes are also very much to be bought out and about when you will be given them in a paper cone, with probably mayonnaise as a topping. Although I think they will have ketchup on hand for the Anglophiles amongst us. And one last snacky food, mussels, which come from Zeeland and are famous the world over. They are also seasonal, best enjoyed between September and March, traditionally served with chips and mayonnaise. What about restaurant meals, traditional Dutch home cooking? One word leaps out, and the word is stampot, or occasionally stampot met rookworst, described on the I Love Amsterdam website as follows. It's the ultimate Dutch comfort food, not dissimilar to British bubble and squeak. It translates literally as mash pot. It's a traditional dish involving potatoes mashed with other vegetables, traditionally various combinations of sauerkraut, carrot, onion or kale, and is usually served with a big, juicy sausage. I think the sausage is the Rookwurst part of the description. Also very wholesome and very traditional, snert, S-N-E-R-T, a sort of cross between a stew and a soup, made with split peas, celery, onions and leeks, so definitely green in colour, often containing some pork as well, and traditionally served by street vendors to ice skaters during the winter when they come off the frozen canals and need something to warm them up. As for ethnic foods, it goes without saying that Amsterdam is a multicultural capital city, so you'll find practically anything you want, but the one cuisine which stands out as being particularly typical of Amsterdam is Indonesian food, connected of course to the fact that the Dutch East India Company had its HQ in Amsterdam, and one of the many things brought back was Indonesian food, and particularly lots of the spices that you would need to prepare it. If you don't know where to start, I suggest the amsterdamfoodie.nl website, where they have at least 10 restaurants to recommend, and where they have the following definition of something called rijsttafel, which translates as rice table, and is the classic way to start enjoying Indonesian food, because it is, quote, dozens of small shareable dishes ranging from mild to spicy in all the colours of the rainbow, served with rice. It's a great way to try lots of dishes in one meal. Satay skewers, generally chicken and goat, are a staple, as are various curries, meat and fish, boiled eggs in spicy sauces, vegetables in peanut sauce, and fried bananas. Somewhere else when I was Googling, I came across the names for some other Indonesian foods, things that you might find on menus. So, just a handful of examples. Bebek betutu, which means duck roasted in banana leaves, or opor ayam, chicken coconut curry. Rendang, an aromatic beef dish braised in coconut milk with chilies and spices. As for the rice, how about nasi goreng, which means fried rice, or nasi kuning, Indonesian yellow rice, nasi uduk, rice steamed in coconut milk. And as for the snacky bits, why not try lemper, which are rice rolls with a spicy filling, or lumpia, spring rolls. We must move on to all things sweet. One of the very, very most typically Dutch things would be apple tart, which they spell with 2 A's at the end, and which you will find everywhere. Various versions, of course, but often flavoured with cinnamon and raisins, served with cream or ice cream. And equal top on the list of very typical things would have to be Dutch pancakes. You'll find indeed lots of pancake houses scattered about the city, and you will see people eating them for various meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner. They can be savoury, they can be sweet. The I Love Amsterdam website explains the following. Every day is pancake day in Amsterdam, from syrupy stacks topped with bacon to a bag of hot buttery poffertjes from a street vendor sprinkled in powdered sugar. And they go on to give a number of restaurant recommendations. Almost as ubiquitous, the Stroopwafel. Wafel is a waffle, stroop I think means syrup. Said to originate actually from elsewhere in the Netherlands, from Gouda in the south, but absolutely everywhere all over the country now, and definitely everywhere in Amsterdam. You can see them being cooked in carts at the side of the road. So a stiff dough is made, flour, butter, sugar, yeast, milk and eggs. Put it into a waffle iron until it's crisp, sandwiched together with a syrup made of more sugar, more butter, and flavoured with cinnamon. Best, of course, eaten hot straight off the cart, but also available in packets, a bit like biscuits, to buy and take home. You won't go far without seeing them, but if you want to go to the best shop in the whole city, I would suggest that would be Wonderen Stroopwafel in the 9 Streets area, a family business that's been running for over a century and sells at least 1 million every year. We cannot talk about food and snacks in Amsterdam without mentioning drop. Drop being the Dutch word for licorice, of which the Dutch are apparently the world's largest consumers per capita. Why would that be? Well, to do with all the trade they did with countries where it was made, perhaps in the early days, the fact that when it first arrived in the Middle Ages, brought by spice merchants, it was thought to have medicinal properties, and I think a big chunk of the reason why it's popular today is that the Dutch have just grown up enjoying it as children. At all the festivals, but perhaps most notably Sinterklaas, which translates into English, of course, as Santa Claus, so Christmas. So it has a nostalgic value too. You will find it too all over the city, on market stalls, in supermarkets, souvenir shops. But again, if you want to seek out one place to find it, I would suggest the Old Dutch Candy Store, which has, of course, a Dutch name, which is almost unpronounceable, but which I'm going to have a go at. Het, I think that means the. Oud, that's old. Hollandsch, I can do that, that's Dutch. And then the mystery word, Snoepwinkeltje. When you find it, you will see that it is like an old-fashioned sweet shop from Granny's day or even earlier. Wooden shelves, glass jars, everything sold by weight, so you choose what you want and they decant it into a paper cone for you to take away. Certainly not just licorice, but certainly also tons and tons of licorice in all its varieties, which can be sweet or salty and come in a whole variety of different shapes and colours. Basic flavour categories would include salmiak, the classic salty flavour, or honingdrop, honey flavour, but there are really too many to mention, and the best advice I can give is do what I did, which is go into a specialist shop and get the assistant to help you. I wanted to try the salty licorice, but not too salty, and the lady narrowed it down for me to a couple of options, which I tasted and bought the one I liked the best. Moving on then to places to go to eat and drink, I've got to mention the grand cafes, of which Amsterdam has quite a few, dating back from the 17th century originally, when coffee and tea were coming in as imports from the East and proving very popular, so naturally Amsterdam became a coffee drinking capital, which it still is today, and there are a number of sort of old world charming grand cafes, largely Belle Epoque sort of style, one of which you'd surely like to visit while you're there. I'd recommend either the Café Amerikaan, which is in the Clayton Hotel in the Leidersplein, dates back to 1902, Art Nouveau interior, so think leaded glass windows, antique chandeliers, murals on the walls, etc. Alternatively, there's the Café Nieuw Amsterdam, housed in what was once the West Indisch House, i.e. the headquarters of the Dutch West India Company, more brass chandeliers, more wooden panelling, and actually a pretty little courtyard garden as well. But then another category which is much more Amsterdam. You might find the Belle Epoque cafes in Paris and other big cities, but the brown cafes, in Dutch, I don't know how you pronounce it, but the brown is spelled B-R-U-I-N, are very much a local feature. Here's the AmsterdamSites.com website on the topic. A brown cafe is similar to a pub. What the pub is for the Londoner, the brown cafe is for the Amsterdammer. They are casual neighbourhood gathering spots where people meet looking for a drink, a snack and some friendly conversation. And they go on then to list 17 of their favourites, so plenty to choose from there. Inside you will typically find a bar with high stools, very possibly something called a stamtafel, which is a table for the regulars, who are known as stamgasten. There might be a billiard table or other games to play. You'll soon spot that the regulars seem to know each other and they know the barman, and the barman knows what they usually drink, might even start pouring it as they arrive. You'll find a variety of different sorts of beer on tap. You'll certainly find jenever, the Dutch version of gin, which you'll get coffee too, and very possibly other hot drinks, and maybe some snacks or some food, but not always. The I Love Amsterdam website has lots of recommendations. I'll quote just a couple. The Café Chris on Bloemenmarkt in the Jordaan area opened in 1624 as a beer house, making it the oldest cafe in the Jordaan area. Or, alternatively, how about the Café Hoppe, also dating from the 17th century, a place where originally gin was distilled and where even today you will find a sawdust floor and a little wood-panelled seating area, although in fact many of the customers prefer to stand. If you go in June, you may catch their annual herring party, which is traditionally held to celebrate the first catch of the new season. Probably ought to mention jenever, the Dutch version of gin, which is flavoured with juniper berries and drunk often in tulip-shaped glasses, which are poured, I don't know why, very full, so that traditionally you stand at the bar and you bend down over your glass and sip it from there, because if you pick it up, you're going to spill it. A little tradition connected with it is something called the kopsvoet, which translates as a knock on the head and means that you order a beer plus a chaser of jenever and you drink both of them in quick succession, so that the resulting feeling is a bit like someone has knocked you over the head. And of course we can't mention Amsterdam and alcoholic drinks in the same sentence without using the word Heineken, a company which started in Amsterdam in 1864 and which now sells beer in over 170 countries. Started by one Gerard Adriaan Heineken, who bought a little brewery in the city when he was only 22, and whose brewings proved so popular that some 25 years later he won the Grand Prix at the Paris Exposition, which of course meant he then started supplying the Eiffel Tower and selling in other well-known places in Europe, and gradually the export business grew and grew. The company's been handed down through the generations. There was Alfred Heineken in the 1950s, said to be an advertising genius, who had a huge success, and whose motto was, apparently, "I don't sell beer, I sell enjoyment." Brewing took place at the main site in Amsterdam until the 1980s, when it was moved elsewhere and the original brewery became the Heineken Experience, somewhere where you can go and visit. If you pay €29.95, you can go on a 2-hour self-guided tour, which will include 3 drinks, and, according to the website, quote, learn all about the Heineken heritage, the brewing process, and the sometimes crazy innovations. Very much the best way to taste and enjoy Heineken beer. If you want to go a little further and spend some €65, then you can do the VIP version of the tour, which will include a personal guide. The 3 drinks will go up to 5. Matching bites, as they call it on the website, will be provided to go alongside, and they will take you to at least one of their pubs. Alternative breweries are available. For example, the breweries, I think it's called, where they have been brewing craft beers since the 1980s. A company started somewhat unusually by a musician who was first brewing in a squat, but whose concoctions soon turned into a big hit, which allowed him to build up the company to the point where today they brew at least 20 different sorts of beer, including some seasonal favourites, grape ale, cherry sour ale, for example. And there are 4 different tasting rooms across the city where you can go and see what you think. I'll put the link for that in the show notes as well. They do guided tours on Fridays and over the weekend, in English or in Dutch, and they too will tell you all about their history, their brewing process, etc. It's a much quicker process, 20 minutes or so, will only cost you €2.50. Doesn't say, but perhaps it doesn't come with any free drinks to taste. Okay then, moving on to shopping. Wanted to start with the markets, which are a big feature of Amsterdam. The most famous one, I think, is the Albert Kuper Markt, which is about 100 years old, the largest, most popular outdoor market in the whole of the Netherlands. You'll find a huge mural of Rembrandt at the entrance, and when you get inside, it's basically all along 2 sides of the same street. You'll find 250, maybe more, stands open 6 days a week, so every day but Sunday. And to let them speak for themselves, here is some of the wording from the Albert Kuip website. Quote, "The Albert Kuip is located in the heart of the De Piep, a vibrant 19th century neighbourhood. It's also known as the Latin Quarter. De Piep is one of the liveliest areas of Amsterdam. Artisan shops, creative entrepreneur, exotic locations, cosy cafes, quality pubs, making it a neighbourhood with character. At the market itself, you will find everything. Yes, really everything. Fruit and vegetables, cheese stalls, butcher's stalls, but not just food, also souvenirs. For example, a fabric stall where you can buy fabric with a print of the old Dutch canal houses on it. Lots of sweets, household goods, a bike repair shop. It is quite popular with tourists, but I'm pretty sure it's the everyday market for everyone who lives anywhere near. There's also lots of food on offer at various food trucks, so here's a place where you can sample raw herring or fried potatoes or freshly cooked Stroopwafel or poffertjes, those little pancakes. I even found a stall which specialised in cannabis lollies of all varying strengths. The Noordermarkt is much older, dates back to the 17th century, and it began as a pottery and cloth market clustered around the church, the Noorderkerk, in the Jordaan area. It's not open every day, it's certainly open on Mondays and Saturdays, selling a diverse range of products, but more antiques, curiosities, books and prints, textiles, glassware, jewellery, vintage clothing and the like, but the Saturday version is also an organic food market. And I found a picturesque description of it in Angels of Amsterdam by Gert Marx. So here are two of the stallholders. First, Paul, who, quote, has a stand at the Noordermarkt. In the shadow of the Noorderkerk he sells his own paradise juice, made from apples and pears, his homemade cider, and often large batches of apples and pears as well. Occasionally he has plums, although that causes trouble, because the Noordermarkt is the most controlled market in the country. You can only trade in products that you have made or grown yourself. And secondly, a goatherd who, quote, sells his small cheeses from the sandy soils of Friesland. He has a herd of 60 white goats at home. In summer they graze in the open. In winter he keeps them in a deep litter house on a thick bed of straw, milking twice a day, feeding, cheese-making, packaging, mending fences, mowing and spreading manure. The city people crowd around his stall, tasting samples of his herb cheese, his charcoal ash cheese, and his goat camembert. They go well with the dram, people tell each other, and they're delicious, accompanied by a strong dessert wine. Gert Marx also explains the historical context, how this is a successor of the markets that used to be found all over Amsterdam. Quote, every day of the week, selling milk, eggs, fish and vegetables, all of it brought in along the waterfield ditches that stretch far and wide, in hundreds of small flatboats, crewed by fishmongers, greengrocers and dairymen. A nursery in Ommen sells plants. A grower from Runevold brings fresh herbs. The cheese and eggs come straight from the Wienwoede in Friesland. The vegetables from the Beemster and the Veuve, and next to Paul stands Jeanne, selling wild flowers. Actually, as we approached the market to have a look, I was quite aware of a number of people who'd bought flowers that day, so I think there are probably several flower stalls. And although there were some tourists and visitors there, I very much again got the impression that this was a market for Amsterdammers themselves. You will surely go to the flower market, which is very centrally situated. The Bloemenmarkt dates back to the 19th century and is unique in Europe, even today, I think. So it began when the flower merchants from the countryside came into the city to sell their flowers on barges, which they parked here along the canal side and turned into little shops. And that is still the system today, although I think the barges today are probably bigger than they used to be. You will find them overflowing with flowers and bulbs of all kinds. If you want fresh bulbs, then the best time to buy those is between the end of August and December. I think you probably won't be able to resist buying a few, but there are all sorts of other things to buy that you might want to take home too. The most charming of which I thought were the little wooden clogs, or sometimes pottery clogs, and little buckets of wooden tulips. One of the large cheese shops is just over the road too, so that's a good place to look round. But even if you're not setting out to buy anything, I do think a wander round is part of a visit to Amsterdam. The fourth market to mention is the Waterlooplein, yes, named after Waterloo, and held in an area which used to be the Jewish quarter. It's about a 15-minute walk from Dam Square. It's open every day but Sunday, and it sells vintage everything. One of those places which is a paradise for people who like to rummage. Clothing, books, antiques, music of various forms, and of course plenty of food trucks. Market-wise, there is just one more thing to mention, and that is what happens on King's Day, which is a national holiday, in April usually. This year, for example, it was Saturday, April the 26th, that's 2025, when one of the quirky traditions is something called the Freemarkt, which means free market, because on that day anybody has the right to set up a shop on the street and sell goods without getting a permit first. So you will find vintage clothes, books, things that people have made or baked, etc., etc., all over the city. And in the Wonderpark, something extra special, because children are allowed to take over there and set up stands, so you'll find them showcasing their entrepreneurial spirit, selling old toys or serving homemade lemonade or doing their magic tricks. So if you happen to be there in April, which unfortunately I wasn't, I should go and give that a go. As for shopping more generally, if it's big standard shops you're looking for, then the Kalverstraat is where you need to be going. But I'm going to talk about two other areas which are much more suitable for a pleasant little wander, perhaps to buy things, maybe just to look and stop for something to eat or drink. The first one is the 9 Streets area, a crisscross of 3x3 little streets wedged in between the canals, quite central, an area with some history. Many of the houses were lived in by the servants who worked in the big canal-side houses. Many of the streets are named after the old industries of Amsterdam, largely leather and trade in animal skins. So there's Hoedenstraat, which means Hide Street. Ree, Bären and Wolvenstraat are deer, bear and wolf streets. It's picturesque. The streets are small and narrow. Inside you will find perhaps 250 shops, galleries, places to eat, museums. The shops are more of the quirky variety, independent shops, let's call them, and very much some specialist ones too, somewhere to browse for fashion or food or gifts. It describes itself on its own website as follows. This special and unique part of the canal belt goes from mishmash to chic, from ethnic to antique, from vintage to contemporary. In amongst all of that, you'll find a number of little museums and places you might want to visit anyway, some quirky ones, for example, the Haus Marseille, which is a photography museum. The Canal Museum is very close, and also the Embassy of the Free Mind, which sadly I never got to, but which is described as a museum and library for lovers of antique books. There's a Bible museum too on the Herengracht. And the second area I wanted to mention is the Spiegelkwartier. So it's quite close to the museum quarter, sort of between the Rijksmuseum and the Herengracht really. Another older area full of 17th century old Dutch houses, so a nice place to wander anyway, and also to pop in and out of the shops. You could stroll down Spiegelgracht and then maybe take a turn into Nieuwe Spiegelstraat, and you'd be pretty much in the typical part. As befits the area it's in, it's quite an arty sort of place, somewhere for some very upmarket rummaging, a place where you'll be very welcome if you're a lover of art or antiques or curiosities. The I Love Amsterdam website told me that there are 70 antique shops and galleries there, where you can buy paintings, ceramics, glass, jewellery, furniture and collectibles. There are wares old and new, but I think probably an emphasis more on the old, but in the best sense of the word. Perhaps I should call it antique. So that rounds off today's episode then. The food and the shopping have both been covered. And in fact it's the last but one episode of the Amsterdam series. So next time, as befits City Breaks tradition, I will be finishing everything off with an anthology episode, a chance to have a listen to some of the fiction set in the city, perhaps one or two extracts from particularly well-written history books, a look at some of the best pieces of travel writing I came across about Amsterdam, pieces perhaps to enjoy for their own sake, or maybe to prompt you to go and seek out the works and read the whole lot. Either way, I hope you'll be able to join me for that, and for the meanwhile, thank you very much for listening. I don't know how to say for listening in Dutch, but I do know thank you. Dank u wel, or possibly hartelijk dank. Either, I think. Both, in fact. And goodbye, which I have seen listed on Google Translate or somewhere as tot ziens.